Welcome to Lecture 15. Today we go to France. Well, after a brief visit to the German state of Württemberg. But eventually we're going to make it to Paris, and at what a time. The key figure in this lecture is a man named Georges Cuvier. He became the grand old man of French natural science by the time he died in 1832, but he came to Paris in 1795. Now, what was happening in Paris in 1795? Lots. Most people choose the spring of 1789 as the beginning of the French Revolution. At that time, it wasn't yet clear that a revolution was in the offing. Certainly not the kind of revolution that France got, anyway. There are various other markers that can be chosen for when the revolution began. Maybe when the king agreed to increase the power of the Third Estate, or perhaps the storming of the Bastille, or when the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was adopted by the National Assembly. But things soon got out of hand, that's for sure. The violence of the terror that occurred, beginning in the summer of 1793, was a truly chaotic time. That lasted about a year before it produced a reaction that led to the downfall of most radical elements. So by 1795, things had cooled somewhat. In that year, a new experiment was instituted, the Directory. France would be governed by a board of 5 directors. It was certainly better than what immediately preceded it, but it wasn't going to last very long. By the end of the century, the Directory was gone. A major factor in its disappearance was the arrival on the French scene of another young man, very close to the age of Cuvier. In fact, I think they were born about 8 days apart, who also came to Paris in 1795. This, of course, was Napoleon Bonaparte, who by 1804 would crown himself Emperor of France and proceed to subjugate the rest of Europe to French domination. So yes, a lot was going on in France around 1795 when the young Georges Cuvier came to town. Now, who was this brash young mover and shaker? He was an example of someone for whom the romantic vision of natural science we met last time didn't take. He'd been exposed to it. In fact, one of his very best friends as a student was Carl Friedrich Kielmayer, whose lecture on the relation among the organic forces we saw to be so important for that new romantic vision. Maybe I'm moving a little too fast here. Let's back up and meet Cuvier properly. Cuvier was with Kielmayer at that special school I mentioned in Lecture 13, the Karlsschule, near Stuttgart. Well, you ask, what's a Frenchman doing in a German school? That's just the thing. Cuvier wasn't really a Frenchman. He spoke French, all right, and he spoke German, too, but he came from the French-speaking Lutheran Principality of Montbéliard, a small independent region between east-central France and Switzerland. It was independent of France, but it was politically united to the Grand Duchy of Württemberg, one of the southern German states, and that was ruled by Grand Duke Karl Eugen. On one of his visits to Montbéliard, the Grand Duke had been told of a talented young man named Georges Cuvier. Now, Karl Eugen was always on the lookout for young talent for his special school, the Karlsschule. That's how Cuvier ended up there as a student. When Georges was born, he was given a different name. In fact, almost everything but Georges. He was Jean-Léopold Nicolas Frederick Cuvier. You see, there was an older brother named Georges who had died just before Cuvier was born, so his parents took to calling him by that name, and it stuck. He kept it, and it's the name by which Cuvier would later identify himself, and by which he would become known to the world. As an adolescent, Cuvier was fascinated by natural history. He had access to the complete edition of Buffon's Natural History in the home of an uncle, and he made good use of it. So by the time he went off to the Karlsschule, it had already become clear that he was going to do well. His parents hoped that he'd become an important figure in the administrative bureaucracy of Württemberg. The school was known to serve the Grand Duke, as a pipeline of young talent that he could tap as needed. But the young Cuvier's interest in natural science was going to get in the way of that. But the education Cuvier got at the Karlsschule turned out to be decisive for him in several ways. For one, he met Kielmayer there and learned a great deal from him. Kielmayer, for example, taught him how to dissect specimens, and he introduced him to what we might call philosophical natural history. You have a very good idea what that means from the last two lectures. Well, Cuvier soon realized that he far preferred dissection and careful empirical observation to Kielmaier's philosophical views. But that doesn't mean that they were wasted on him. They were part of the general influence that this German-speaking school had on a native French speaker. There were students at the school from all over Europe. Cuvier came across a much richer mix of ideas here than he ever would have had he stayed in Montbéliard for sure. In fact, Cuvier's mastery of German and his attendance at the Karlsschule gave him a more diverse education than he would have had in the French institutions of higher learning available to him at the time. When the time came for graduation, Cuvier was passed over for a position in the Württemberg bureaucracy. I don't know the whole story there. I do know that he used his spare time at the school to pursue the study of natural science, and that this was not something you normally did. It may have been that he was regarded as too much of an outsider after all. I mean, he probably spoke German with a detectable French accent, though I'm speculating about that. I don't really know. Whatever the reason, he now had to determine what to do. So he decided to take up an offer that came his way from a fellow Protestant, this one not in Lutheran Württemberg, but in northern France. He'd been approached about becoming a tutor to the son of a Protestant French nobleman in Normandy. So he opted to do it. Now, he couldn't have known it, but as he left for France, it was the eve of the French Revolution. Over the next 7 years, Cuvier enjoyed more freedom to do as he pleased than he'd ever had in his life. And how do you think he used it? Right. He continued to study natural science on his own. He was in rural France, there in Normandy, but he could get materials from Paris, and he learned about what was going on in the French capital. He also began to correspond with a number of savants in Paris whose reputations had come to his attention. No sense not bringing himself to their attention. Cuvier would never be one to shun self-promotion. Well, of course, the revolution was running its course in these years. Cuvier weathered it in good shape. In fact, because he was one of the few educated non-aristocrats in that rural area, he was elected secretary to the local commune in the fall of 1793, and that was just as the terror of the revolution was heating up. To his credit, he didn't abandon his nobleman employer. He spoke in his defense on more than one occasion. But by 1795, he was ready to try his hand in the capital. Make a long story short, he succeeded incredibly well. By the end of that year, his career was taking off. He did so well, so quickly, that it's worth asking how he pulled it off. For one thing, the old boy patronage network of the Ancien Regime, the old regime, had been disrupted in fundamental fashion during the Revolution. One effect of that was that it made it easier for Cuvier to obtain entry into the world of Parisian science. Of course, he also exploited the contacts he had cultivated by correspondence, and he did that very successfully. Plus, he made new contacts after arriving in the city. He was appointed an assistant, and shortly thereafter became a professor of animal anatomy at the newly reformed National Museum of Natural History. That's the old Garden of the King we've encountered a couple of times in earlier lectures on the 18th century. During the Revolution, it was given a new name. So here he was, in Paris, and at the time when the old hoops he would have had to jump through were gone. He'd gotten himself a position, he was ready to get to work, and get to work he did. Cuvier's boldness in self-promotion reminds me a little bit of Linnaeus. By this time, Linnaeus' system of classification was well known and accepted in many parts of Europe. Oh, it had its share of critics. I mentioned that Buffon had not liked it back in the 18th century. Well, neither did Cuvier. With the arrogance of youth, he set out to replace it. And in so doing, his aversion to German romantic biology came shining through. Let me explain. After he arrived in Paris, one of the first new acquaintances he made was that of a young Paris naturalist around his own age. His name was Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. Geoffroy was also critical of Linnaeus' system, so he and Cuvier appeared right away to have something in common. They both felt that Linnaeus' system was inadequate. Why? Because, as we learned back in Lecture 8, Linnaeus drew boundaries between groups of organisms based on physical characteristics. Yes, and? Well, Cuvier and Geoffroy felt that animal organization was too complex for that. Linnaeus' approach was too simplistic. If you rely merely on physical characteristics, you can end up grouping together animals that don't really belong together. And you can also end up separating others that were in fact alike in important ways. Geoffroy's approach was very different from Linnaeus's. Geoffroy actually had a disposition a little like that of the Germans we've met. Wasn't anywhere near as abstruse as the Germans could be. I mean, they could really be difficult to follow when they got going, but Geoffroy you could follow. For all that, he still came at the matter with an abstract idea in his mind. He believed in an idea he called the unity of composition. This was the common plan of organization he thought nature had used in producing living things. So you see the similarity to the Germans. Now, Cuvier liked Geoffroy. They had become friends. But he didn't like this philosophical approach. He hadn't liked it much in Kielmeyer back at the Karlsschule. He didn't very much like this French version either. Well, what did he propose? He began working on a new system of classification. It wouldn't be published until later, in 1817, but the idea for the project he had in his head already. It would be based on the way the body functioned. In particular, he'd take his cue from how the nervous system in animals relates to organs of motion. Using this criterion, Cuvier concluded that there were 4 fundamental branches of animals. This was based on the 4 different arrangements Cuvier found in the animal kingdom by which the organs of motion were related to the nervous system. Now, we don't have time enough for me to go into Cuvier's new system of classification more than that. Let me just say that when he employed it, he did so in a way that was very different from Geoffroy's approach. Geoffroy was looking for the unity of composition in the whole animal world. Cuvier insisted that each group of organisms be considered in itself, without abstracting a relationship to other groups of organisms. In other words, he didn't want to come to nature with the assumption that there was some abstract way in which all organisms related to all other organisms. He thought he'd found from empirical observation that there were different ways nature accomplished motion in animals. He didn't like assuming that there was one general plan in nature. In fact, he opposed the idea of a scale of being, in which one organism was seen as more perfect than another. That implied that there was a standard of some sort that each individual organism could be measured against. This difference in approach, then, was evident right from the start after he arrived in Paris. Now, Cuvier is known for his new system of classification, but his reputation was really made for another reason, and that was his work with fossils. It created a stir in Paris around the turn of the century and throughout the reign of Napoleon. In fact, Napoleon was a real help to Cuvier. I don't mean deliberately or directly. I mean that Napoleon's military victories ended up having a beneficial effect for those who worked on fossils, or for anyone who worked in the Paris museums. The reason was that when Napoleon defeated another country in battle, he would bring back the spoils of war to France. So some choice collections ended up in Paris institutions in this way. One set of bones from the Netherlands was of special importance because these bones allowed Cuvier to declare that they represented a species that no longer existed. Now, you may be a little surprised to hear that the idea of extinction would have been so sensational at the time. Many people assume that of all the ways that the old notion that species were fixed would have been challenged, extinction surely must have been the first. No, the first challenge to a rigid interpretation of the fixity of species came in the assertion that new species had arisen since the creation, that there had been an origin of species. We saw that, for example, with Linnaeus. So extinction was big news here at the end of the 18th century. Sure, some of Cuvier's predecessors in the 18th century had implied in their work that life had been different in the past, but implying it, especially in a speculative theory, say like de Maillet's, that's one thing. Cuvier could stand before a crowd in a public lecture and point to actual remains from the past, remains that were lying there right in front of him, of an organism that was in fact different from anything in the present. Well, he had to convince his audience that it was different from anything that was now alive, but that's exactly what he did. He demonstrated that the extinction of species had in fact occurred. These were animals that had once existed and no longer existed. They had existed even before recorded history. It was Cuvier who introduced this sensational news to the popular mind. Let me set the scene. The public lecture, 1796, Cuvier's newly in town. He talked about fossil remains that were there in the museum. Some were those that Napoleon's victories had brought in, some were already part of the collection. He began with a discussion of the two kinds of elephants that were known, the African and the Indian. You'll see his purpose in a second. What he did was, first, to convince his audience on the basis of a close analysis of the anatomical features of remains from these kinds of elephants, that they were in fact different species. Then he used the same criteria to analyze bones from an enormous animal the Siberians called a mammoth. On the basis of the same anatomical features he'd referred to in his analysis of the elephants, he showed why the remains of the mammoth were different from both species of elephants. This was something different from elephants. Now, many in Europe were aware of the so-called mammoth, but they assumed it was just the remains of an elephant. For example, back in the 18th century, Buffon had identified large fossil bones found in a northern region as those of an elephant. Cuvier raised the question of whether the great Buffon had been right in doing this. Of course, Buffon had a natural explanation of why an elephant had been found so far north. Remember, he was the one who said that the Earth had once been a piece of the sun that cooled. That meant that at some time in the past, the northern latitudes would have been warmer than they are now. So an elephant being there would not be out of the question. But Cuvier said that Buffon had been wrong in thinking that the bones were from an elephant. He felt these animals from the deep past that lived in the north were a separate species from elephants, and that they were adapted to colder climes. This mammoth had had fur that protected it. No matter how much its remains looked like those of an elephant, when you looked carefully, if you knew what you were doing, you could discern that it wasn't an elephant. It was something we never knew about before. Let me give you an idea of why Cuvier became so convincing as he fired the imagination of his listeners with talk of ancient creatures that once had roamed the earth but now no longer existed. He did it by introducing French natural philosophers to two new ideas. One he called the conditions of existence, and the other the subordination of characters. They go together. Let me show you how. The conditions of existence are just what you might think. The environmental conditions in which the animal lived. Nothing profound there. These conditions, Cuvier said, were interconnected with the organism that had come into existence there. Or you could say that the organisms were adapted to the conditions in which it existed. In any event, the interconnection between the two, the organisms and the conditions of its existence, was such that only certain relations among the anatomical parts were possible. And that's where the subordination of characters comes in. The subordination of characters involved matching the characteristics of an animal to the physical conditions that determine them. Cuvier emphasized that the anatomical characteristics of an organism were subordinated to these conditions of existence. And as a result, he said, the anatomical features an animal had were, as he put it, not at all the product of chance. Cuvier determined that he was going to become so familiar with the correlations among the anatomical parts of organisms that he would then be able to draw on his expertise when analyzing their bones. If he knew the correlations, then he could recreate information about them from their parts. If a split hoof went with certain kinds of teeth, then he might be able to anticipate what kind of food an animal ate just from the nature of its foot. In other words, he would be like Sherlock Holmes, whose character I know hadn't been created yet, but he'd be like Holmes in being able to solve the whole mystery from one or two simple facts of observation. In Cuvier's case, the whole mystery was the whole organism. He could figure out an amazing amount of information about the whole organism from fossil remains of one or two of its parts. In fact, Cuvier used precisely this kind of reasoning in an analysis he made of a fossil that had been found in Buenos Aires. Well, he didn't actually have the fossil itself, he had drawings of it. Anyway, from just an analysis of its claws and teeth, he concluded that it belonged to the family that also contained sloths, armadillos, and anteaters. But then, because it also had features that were unlike any existing members of that family, Cuvier pronounced that the remains were those of an extinct animal. He called it a megatherium. Now, all this was intriguing, of course. People loved to hear Cuvier make these arguments about prehistoric beasts that no longer existed. It was exciting, very fascinating. But there were a couple of questions that plagued at least some of the listeners. How did Cuvier know these animals didn't exist today? Couldn't it be possible that Cuvier's right about their being different from known animals, but wrong about their not being around anymore? Cuvier dismissed this objection. He just refused to buy the idea that live animals, like the ones whose remains he had analyzed, might still be alive somewhere in the world and we not know about it. There had been too many travelers, too many explorers. The world, he thought, was too well known for sightings of such magnificent creatures not to have been made. Now, these beasts were extinct. Well, then another question. Let's give Cuvier the benefit of the doubt that these prehistoric beasts no longer roamed the earth. What happened to them? Why don't they still exist? What kind of power would be able to wipe out all the members of a whole species? This question was one that Cuvier had pondered too, and he had come up with an explanation that he was happy with. He had a very definite idea what had happened that brought about the extinction of these species. They had, he said, in that very first lecture on the elephants, 1796, been destroyed by some kind of catastrophe. Now, this idea of catastrophes was not original with Cuvier. It had been around in earlier thinkers about the Earth's past who were interested in confirming that the biblical flood was a reasonable scenario. And although Cuvier was not concerned to shore up the biblical account, he did latch on to the idea early in conjunction with his work on fossils. The full exposition of his theory of catastrophes found its way into print in 1812. It appeared as part of one of Cuvier's classic publications. This one was his Investigations on Fossil Bones, and it was full of his ideas about the meaning of fossils. On the question of what had wiped out the whole species of animals, or entire species of animals, Cuvier first insisted that the cause of extinction could not have been due to forces at work in the present. How did he know this? Well, he said, look at some of the carcasses we've found. Some of them have been preserved in ice. They weren't remains of old rotting animals. Their deaths must have come about as a result of sudden and violent causes. Like what, you ask? Well, Cuvier suggested that perhaps there had been an inundation of water or a sudden elevation of land. These could have wiped out the forms of life in the region, and then the remains of those forms had been preserved. If there hadn't been a major disruption in the course of life, some sort in that region, they would have simply rotted away instead of being preserved as they had been. But there was something else going on here as well. I mean, Cuvier had a motive that he wasn't talking about. You see, Cuvier was well aware of the ideas of some that there had been a transformation of species over time. He certainly knew, for example, about the implications of de Maillet and Buffon about life in the past, which we examined back in Lecture 3. He likely also knew about the work of the Englishman Erasmus Darwin. This was the grandfather of Charles Darwin. Charles, incidentally, was only a little boy in 1812. Erasmus wrote a book, The Temple of Nature, in 1802, that celebrated a grand evolutionary development of life. And then there was Kielmeyer, of course, but whether Cuvier became aware of Kielmeyer's ideas on evolution, I don't know. Kielmeyer came more clearly to them after Cuvier left for France, although they continued to be in correspondence with each other. Anyway, he didn't care much for any of these ideas about life developing over time. They were all way too speculative for Cuvier's tastes. And even more close to home, there was a senior colleague right there in Paris who was well known to hold similar ideas. This was a man named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he published an elaborate evolutionary system in 1809. We'll learn about him in our next lecture. But as I said, Cuvier didn't like this whole trend of thought. He was convinced that if you were going to argue that species had changed over time, you had to base the argument on evidence, not on speculation, as part of some grand theory. Now, the only evidence he thought relevant was that of the fossil record. And the fossil record didn't support the idea of a gradual evolution over time. The word in France at the time was transformism. That's the word they used for evolution, what we call evolution. In Cuvier's view, the fossil record indicated something else. You guessed it. He felt the fossil record clearly indicated that there had been periodic catastrophes. But if Cuvier denied that present animals had arisen from prehistoric species by evolution, then how did they arise? And what relation did present species have to the prehistoric creatures that Cuvier, more than anyone else, had shown to be extinct? Well, here's what Cuvier said. He started out by saying that God had originally created all the species that had ever lived or would ever live. Now, Cuvier wouldn't have struck you as a particularly religious man if you knew him in France in the early decades of the 19th century. For example, he wasn't much of a churchgoer, and he wasn't concerned very much about the Bible story of creation. What I mean is that he wasn't tied to a literal interpretation of the Bible. But in fact, he did have his own particular religious beliefs, and they were very important to him. First, he was a Protestant in a Catholic country. That made him, to some degree, constantly aware of religion, because he was in the minority all the time. But more important than that, he very much believed in God. And it was extremely important to him that God be acknowledged as the creator of life and of the species that existed. It was Cuvier's particular way of merging natural science and religion, of putting them together. Cuvier was the kind of person who had strong opinions on everything he believed. So when he declared that God had originally created all the species that had ever lived or would ever live, you knew he wasn't just saying it lightly. Okay, then what happened? Well, over time, catastrophes had occurred, and when they did, they winnowed out numerous species. Those were the ones that had become extinct. But some avoided elimination. They had never been in a region where or when a catastrophe had occurred. After the catastrophe, new life forms had migrated into the area from these neighboring regions that had been untouched by the catastrophes. Cuvier specifically denied that special creations by God were responsible for the new life that flourished following a catastrophe. What about humans? What did all this mean about their past? Well, human remains were never present among the fossil bones of the prehistoric beasts that Cuvier had identified. Cuvier implied that humans had existed at the same time as these beasts, but had not existed in the same region. Clearly, humans, unlike the prehistoric beasts, had escaped extinction from catastrophic events. Of course, his colleague Lamarck didn't go along with this explanation. He had a very different approach to the whole thing from this upstart young natural philosopher. And we're going to learn all about that in our next lecture.